Hello, aviation operations students. This is the second mini lecture for week 12, covering human resources. We're going to look at some of the laws and regulations having to do with employees. So let's get started. All right. One of the things that you really need to keep in mind is employment discrimination. Because if you do discriminate against employees in the hiring process, in employing them and promoting them, you have a potential to be sued. In all 50 states, race, color, national origin, religion, sex, and that includes pregnancy, childbirth, and related medical conditions, physical or mental disability, age, 40 or older, citizenship status, and genetic information are all protected. Now, for example, if you were hiring a woman who was pregnant, that might be something that not in the interview process, but in the hiring process you could discuss. You would probably want clearance from their doctor before you let them fly. But actually, women have been able to fly quite far into their pregnancies. Citizenship status. Again, you have to have FAA certifications and certain documents if someone's going to work for you. So it is correct to ask about those things in the hiring process. Genetic information, that is if someone knows that they have, for example, a gene for a disease that could possibly get for that to be considered as part of their hiring, that is illegal. Montana has additional protected classes: veteran status, religion and creed, marital or family status, political beliefs or ideas, sexual orientation or preference, gender identity, gender expression, and transgender. This is the link where you can get information on it. The university has definite details and definitions on each of these categories. And you need to remember it in two ways. Is number one, you do not want to ask a question that covers any of these. And if anyone offers information on that, you just say thank you and move on, because you're not supposed to be considering any of these in the hiring process. Again, these are really important. You cannot ask questions about any of these factors, even if they bring them up. Make sure that your application questions and your interview questions, unless it's a requirement for the job, do not address any of the national and state issues. Also, if you're working for a government organization or you're doing a government contract, there may be additional requirements there. You cannot consider these in selecting the priority of your candidates. One of your candidates may have revealed that they are a single parent. You need to keep that out of your decision. If you violate these laws, the Human Rights Commissioner can take action against you. You can be sued. Now, if it is specific to the performance of the job, you can ask if the candidate has the ability to do the job. For example, to stand for 8 hours, to lift 75 pounds, to work at the computer, to work shifts. Those are legitimate questions. You don't ask them why or why not. You can ask those if they are requirements for the job, but they need to really be requirements for the job. So last week we had an interview with Beverly Bunch, who was an environmental health and safety consultant, and she is helping companies comply with OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Act. You can receive a free consultation with the Montana Department of Labor to help set up a workplace that's as safe as possible. If you're concerned about things and you don't want to be dinged, you can hire a consultant to help you work through the process. For a small business, that Montana Department of Labor overview is probably pretty good. If you're doing anything where you're working with hazardous chemicals and things like that, that's where you may want to call in an OSHA consultant. Or sorry, a consultant that follows the OSHA information. And they can help you create processes and procedures. Some of you met my father out at the C-130. He is also a safety engineer. And so you need to know that businesses with 8 or more employees are required to record work-related illnesses or injuries. If you have less than 8 employees, it is still a really good idea to have a report form and make that part of your procedures because that avoids issues further on. So it allows you to, first of all, have a record of what happened. So if the story changes, you know that. And also, you should learn from every incident to try to improve workplace safety. Workers' compensation. This is insurance paid to handle any workplace illness or injury. It is required even if there's only 1 employee, and even if they are a volunteer or work study. The rates are based on the kind of work done, and it pays medical bills and for impairment or death. Montana has not some of the best work situations, so actually in Montana, workers' compensation can be high. You can also look at industry organizations that might have policies that are not as expensive as the ones available through the state. So it does not absolve the employer of liability if they have an unsafe workplace or if they did not follow their own policies. If an employee does not follow a procedure, but they're hurt at work, workers' compensation is still most likely going to apply. It is not inexpensive, but it is a lot less costly than having an employee sue you, or for you having to pay for medical bills and the death or impairment of an employee. And again, it is required by both federal and state law. Another air vehicle submitted by a student. Montana's minimum wage. When we look at comparable worth, how much are you going to pay someone to bring them on board? $8.75 an hour is the minimum wage in Montana. Most local businesses looking for relatively unskilled labor because of the tightness of our labor force is offering $12 to $16 per hour plus benefits as a starting wage. A living wage in Montana, that is, you can work 1 full-time job and afford to feed yourself. Single person, most likely full-time, most likely you're going to have roommates because $14.98 is considered a living wage. We'll look at that in a minute. 2 adults, both working full-time with 2 kids, $21.68. However, the current average price of a 1-bedroom apartment is $15.50. You should not be paying more than 30% of your income for accommodations. That would come out to $29.81 per hour. So we know that there's a big disconnect in Bozeman between the cost of housing and what people are able to be paid. So you have to find a balance in here someplace. So for example, 1 coffee shop in town pays $12 an hour, but covers most of health coverage for their employees, while another one does not provide those benefits for their employees, but pays $16 an hour. Unless someone is exempt from overtime provisions, an employee must be paid at a rate of 1 1/2 their regular hourly rate for all hours worked over 40 hours per week. There are some cases where it's 8 hours per day, but for Montana, for the most part, it is 40 hours per week. If you are salaried and you are a manager, you are exempt and you do not have to be paid for overtime. This does include adjusting for commissions. So if you have people who are making a lower hourly rate, but they make commissions, that figures in. So to figure out what comparable worth is, what people are being paid for a particular job, the labor website I showed you earlier is one place you can look. Websites like Indeed or Glassdoor or industry websites can give you information to determine a fair wage and to make sure you're paying the same wage for the same work to avoid a discrimination lawsuit, to avoid a wage dispute. And I also want you to consider why else you want to do this, making sure comparable worth, that you are paying appropriate compensation and that you are paying the same wage for the same work in your company. So again, this is something I'd like you to consider. And you saw the C-130, they're cargo aircraft that can go anywhere, anytime. They can be outfitted for refueling and various other missions as well. Payroll taxes and deductions. As an employer, you are responsible for these. You need to collect income tax. You need to collect Social Security. 6.2% is paid by the employer and 6.2% by the employee. Medicare Each pays 1.45%. So if you are your own employer or a 1099 employee, that is a contract employee, you pay both halves, both the employer and the employee half, so 15.3% of your income. So if you are working on a contract and being paid on a contract basis, you want to make sure you're putting that money aside to pay with your taxes at the end of the year. An accountant or an accounting program can help you ensure that you're calculating correctly. And it is very important in payroll to make sure that as an employer, you are making the deductions and that you're paying them on time. Unemployment. Individual employer contribution rates are determined by calculating the employer's reserve ratio. That is how much you have in the bank. So if you are paying in and you don't have a lot of employees leaving and trying to collect unemployment, the amount you pay, your rate is going to consistently go down. However, as a new employer, you're often going to have a higher rate dependent on the industry, and if you become delinquent, that is your employees collect more than you pay in, that can go up even further. Unemployment related to COVID-19 does not count against you as an employer. So if someone has left your organization and it is related to COVID-19, you need to make sure that the forms were filled out that way. Again, as a small new business, you may be collecting these every payroll, but only paying them quarterly. But you have to pay attention because now certain federal taxes have to be paid every month. Others only have to be paid quarterly. And some, if you're a small business, may only have to be paid annually. And this is changing rapidly. So it's something you want to keep track of. If you pay these late, there are penalties and interest you have to pay. Employee records. You should maintain employee records from the time they're recruited or apply throughout their employment, including any records required for hiring. Because again, you could be charged with discrimination in the hiring process. So the people you don't hire, you want to make sure you keep all those applications, interview notes, anything that you have on them in a file. So if a question comes up, you have it. These records must be kept confidential. Anything that's personal information on an employee must be kept confidential. So things like the job, you can have a folder that has the job posting, application, interview records, offer letter, reference and background checks, I-9 verification, and in aviation, that is very important. Any drug and alcohol testing, physical exams, certifications, employee handbook receipt, we'll go over that in a little bit, licenses and certifications. You, again, for those that you recruited but did not employ, you can just keep a file about that round of hiring. But for your employee, you should also have all these things in their personal file as well. Payroll, compensation, health and benefits, vacation, sick time, and other benefits. That may be in an online accounting program. Evaluations, promotions, transfers, and any discipline records should also be kept in that file. Reduction in force, separation, termination, and COBRA records, if you're providing them with insurance beyond the time they leave, should all be included. Because if a question ever comes up about any of this and you're accused of doing it wrong, you want to have those records to back it up. So again, you should keep these for at least 2 years from the date the record was made or from the date of the personnel action involved, whichever occurs later. In most cases, you are going to keep those records the entire time a person is employed, plus 2 years. Employee access, so you need to think about this. Which employees can see this information? Which employees can supervise someone seeing the information? And which cannot see another employee's records? And under what circumstances can employees see their own records? So some things they have open access to and they can make copies of. Others they are generally allowed to look at in your office and they can take notes on them and someone should supervise them. So for example, an accountant has, someone who's running payroll has to have information about how much someone is paid. They're probably running the program that pays for their benefits and everything else. So they do need that information. They don't necessarily need to know information about demotions or anything like that unless it results in a change in pay. Again, another aircraft that was submitted. So when you have decided who you're going to make the offer to, you're getting ready. Make sure you rank the candidates in order. And again, you're going to probably take the top 2 to 4, there's usually a natural break in there, and check their references. Some people wait until after they have interviewed to check the references. Personally, I like to before, because sometimes a person sounds too good on paper, and when you check your references, you find out that they are. Decide what you're going to offer them, including pay, expected hours, starting date, training schedule, work assignments, and benefits, if any. And be prepared for them to make a counteroffer. Are you willing to offer a little more of something, and what's your hard line? Also, once you make an offer, you want to make sure that in that offer letter you make clear if there are any remaining hoops to jump through before employment is final. Do they have to take a physical? Do they have to take a drug and alcohol test? And so you say in the letter that this offer is contingent on these happening. Do they have to finish their training? Do they have to, even if they're a month from graduation in college and you want them to have that associate's degree, if you're making the offer before they've graduated, make sure you put that contingency in there. And is the person allowed to train in that period, or are they not? Those are decisions you have to make and be ready to answer. And then clarify probationary status. It defaults to 6 months in Montana if it's not stated. 1 year is not an uncommon practice, but think about it as a no-fault divorce. They can quit without having to give you any reason, and you can decide that they are just not a fit with your company, again, without having to provide any disciplinary actions or reason for saying, hey, this isn't working out. The job offer can be done in person, by phone, email, or letter. Once they've accepted the position, make sure the agreement is in writing and provide them with any policies. If you're giving them a handbook, you want to make sure you have a receipt for them acknowledging they got it and they know they have to read it. Only once they are on board do you send regrets. And it's best if it's done the way they last contacted you. So if they applied and had no interview, an email response is fine. If they did have an interview, whether in person, phone, or Skype, a phone call is recommended. Always be nice. The person you hired might not work out, or you may need to hire another person, a similar position in the future. So you want to make sure that when you call and let people know that it's not going to happen, that you do it in a polite and respectful way. So now, once that happens, what does your new employee need to know before they can be an effective employee? You're going to have some kind of orientation on onboarding. You may have safety training and other trainings that you do. An employee handbook, a procedures handbook, any of those you want to make sure they have. You're going to introduce them to people in the company. You should give them a tour of all the facilities, and you may set them up with a mentor that's going to help them and be available for questions when they come on board. Never assume that they know something. Always check for understanding and train as needed. It's better to ask a stupid question and make sure they know how to do something instead of assuming that they do and letting them do something and an issue happens. And remember the delegation rules. You want to make sure that they're about 80% ready before you set them off to do something. And you also want to make sure that there's someone there to provide that 20% of support as needed. Things you want to have in your employee handbook: company history, policies and procedures, facilities, organizational structure, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit, employee conduct and responsibilities, compensations, rewards, benefits, evaluation program and schedule. When they first come on board, do you evaluate them every 3 months, every 6 months, once a year? Promotion policy, if it's applicable, if there's opportunities for promotion. Your safety and security program and procedures, overview of emergency plan and procedures, training opportunities. What kind of training opportunities are there? Do you pay for them completely? Do they pay for part of it? Emergency contact information. If something happens, who do they talk to? So a best practice is to give new hires the employee handbook. Then 3 days later, follow up for any questions, check for understanding on key points, and have them sign to acknowledge receipt and that they have read the documents that you've given them. Now they're ready to work. Training methods. It can be on the job by the supervisor or other more experienced employees. Maybe you have a classroom at the workplace, which may have inside or outside instructors. Apprenticeships. Special courses or seminars off premises. For example, If you're upgrading to an aircraft, your company may send you to Dallas to get training in that aircraft type. So as you think about on-the-job training, who is the right person to do that training? Make sure that they know what the new worker is expected to learn, how that person is supposed to check, and how they will let you know. Make sure the trainer knows what is expected, the timetable, and has the necessary resources, and knows who they should reach out to if it's not going as expected. Prepare the worker, put them at ease. Start with simple tasks, determine what they already know, and then increase the difficulty of the task. A little bit of success adds some confidence. If they say they already know the task or information, still check before moving on to the next step. Say, yes, but we want to see everybody do this. Tell, show, illustrate one point at a time. Have them practice with the trainer's help and correct as needed. Once you've done it, they've done it with the trainer, and they seem to have mastered it, have the new worker complete the task themselves, evaluating and giving frequent feedback. Make sure they understand what they're doing correctly and what things they need to adjust. Be constructive in your feedback, pointing out something positive and being specific with the corrections and recommendations. Move on to more challenging tasks, making sure each one is understood before moving on. Follow up. Once they've begun doing the tasks on their own as part of the job, don't forget them. Put a system in place to periodically follow up to make sure they have it down. Maybe check with them at the end of the first few days, check with them at the end of a week, a couple weeks. Make sure they know who to go to for help. Once they've completed training, it may not be the trainer. Encourage questions, provide informative answers, and make sure they know that they are free to ask questions. It's better to ask a stupid question than to do something wrong. But remember, developing talent is not just for your new employees. For all of your employees, are there opportunities for advancement? What skills, knowledge, experience is needed? How can you help the employee develop those skills? Maybe someone who's not a supervisor can step in when the supervisor's on vacation or on an evening shift or something else. Are there ways that you can help the employee develop the skills? Are you willing to train them? So again, on-the-job training, substituting for a supervisor or manager, mentoring, sending them to trade shows, or providing outside training. You need to continuously evaluate this process and evaluate your pool. If you know someone is committed to your company and they are reliable and a good person to have as part of your team, then that's a person you want to keep and potentially promote. And that is the end of the second one. We're going to move on to communication and motivation in human resources. Thank you all for finishing number 2. I will be providing number 3 shortly.